So if you've been on Twitter in the past 12 hours, you'll know that hashtag Fire Chris Hayes has been trending specifically because he decided to cover the Tara Reade sexual assault allegations. Now, you may hear that and think to yourself, well, okay, so he picked a side. He was either pro Tara Reade or anti Tara Reade, and then, the other side is coming at him for it. Nope, that's not what happened at all. Chris Hayes just decided to cover the story, just talk about the story in the first instance, but that was enough to trigger a bunch of Biden bros to go after Chris Hayes and attack him on Twitter, saying that he shouldn't have covered the story at all, saying that was inappropriate. So I want to show you the clip of Chris Hayes talking about Tara Reade, and then we'll be back to discuss.
Throughout the entire Me Too era, there have been moments, I think for many of us, for all of us, when we have heard about accusations against someone that we find ourselves desperately wanting not to believe. Whether that is because we have some personal admiration for the individual or their work, or political admiration, someone on our quote-unquote side. But part of the difficult lesson of the Me Too era is not that every accusation is true and everything should be believed on its face, but that you do have to fight yourself when you feel that impulse. You have to do that in order to take seriously what is being alleged and what the evidence is and to evaluate it. And that is the case with the accusation by a woman named Tara Reade against Joe Biden. Reade briefly worked as a Senate aide in Biden's office in the early 90s. Last year, she told a California newspaper that in 1993, Joe Biden, quote, touched her several times, making her feel uncomfortable. Now, at that time, Reade was one of several women who came forward around that moment with accusations against the former vice president of inappropriate sort of over physicalness, touching, kissing, or hugging that they say made them feel uncomfortable. Then last month, she made a much more serious allegation, telling first a podcast and later the New York Times that in 1993, Joe Biden pinned her to a wall in the Senate building, reached under her clothing, and penetrated her with his fingers. Reade told the Times that she filed a complaint with the Senate that same year about what happened with Biden. Quote, she said she did not have a copy of it and such paperwork has not been located. In following this, one of the things that happened to Me Too and a piece of evidence that has risen in how I evaluate these stories is a somewhat contemporaneous disclosure to a trusted person who then tells a reporter about it. That is what has happened here. And to me, that has been, in terms of what the evidentiary record is, has raised it a bit in my own view of this.
I feel the same way. I actually thought that the Times reporting, which was very inconclusive on the assault claim, corroborated for me something, which was her claim that she had complained about harassment and then suffered a professional consequence while working in Biden's office. The New York Times reporting on this story actually backed that up for me a couple of weeks ago because it found a couple of interns who she had supervised who remembered her suddenly being taken off of, having suddenly and without explanation, no longer supervising them. That was pretty persuasive for me on that count.
So, you just saw there Chris Hayes more or less just laying out the set of allegations, saying that Tara Reade said this, then she said that, and then that's how this thing has progressed. Now, you could maybe criticize it a little bit, saying that Chris Hayes should have brought in a little bit more information about the Larry King tapes or something of that sort. But overall, honestly, I wasn't too upset about it. This is probably one of the best, if not the best coverage that we've seen so far in the mainstream media, so I'm not going to sit here and complain about it. But I mentioned earlier that Biden bros were really, really upset, really triggered on Twitter about this. Again, they made the hashtag Fire Chris Hayes go viral. It was trending on Twitter that, we need to fire Chris Hayes over this because they were really upset thinking that, Chris Hayes was basically saying that Joe Biden is 100% guilty. But if you watch that clip there, that is not what Chris Hayes said. Although I do want to make sure that I'm being entirely fair to the other side. I want to make sure that I'm fairly representing their argument. Some people, hashtagging Fire Chris Hayes, some of the Biden bros making that hashtag were arguing that the real issue with the hashtag was that Chris Hayes was implying there at the beginning, you saw at the beginning when he was saying that there has always been allegations that we maybe don't want to believe, that we desperately don't want to believe, and then, sort of bringing in the allegation. So they were arguing that Chris Hayes was implying that they were being sort of intellectually dishonest when it comes to this story. And they're saying that, no, we simply just don't believe Tara Reade, or, we just don't think that that the evidence brought here are sort of up to that standard. Now, I've mentioned this on this channel before. I've talked about it quite a bit. I really do think that there is a very, very different standard being applied here to Tara Reade than was applied, especially when you look at the incident of Christine Blasey Ford and Brett Kavanaugh. Because in that particular instance, I mean, Christine Blasey Ford specifically said that she didn't tell people at the time, and the only thing that we really had were some therapist notes from a few years back. Now, again, I believed Christine Blasey Ford at the time, and I still believe her now. But in the case of Tara Reade, the evidence, or the sort of corroborating witnesses, however you want to frame it, at the time, I mean, she told so many different people at the time. We know that she told her brother. We know that she told a close friend. We know now that she told her mother of at least something that happened at the time because of the Larry King tapes. And now we know that within only a few short years after the incident, she told a neighbor at the time, and also she told her next employer about being sexually assaulted in when she was in DC. So, I mean, at this point, we have a number of corroborating witnesses. We have contemporaneous support for, that she told people at the time, which has been the typical general standard when it comes to the Me Too movement. So it does seem to me that a very, very different standard is being applied to Joe Biden than to other people. But I want to show you guys sort of this stuff here, because it really seemed like yesterday the floodgates really opened up, and it seemed like the media was slightly turning on Joe Biden a little bit. It seemed like the sort of narrative was shifting a little bit. So the New York Times came out and refuted the Biden campaign's report about the allegation. So basically what happened was the Biden campaign, there was some leaked talking points that were going through, and we saw Stacey Abrams, we've seen Kamala Harris, we've seen Kirsten Gillibrand, a number of the people who, are possible VP picks, we've seen all of them running with these talking points, which is that the New York Times cleared Joe Biden. But that wasn't the case. In fact, the New York Times reporting did dig into it, and they basically said that we don't know one way or another. The New York Times report really just sort of laid out the various allegations, and I mean, you could argue that the New York Times report wasn't entirely fair. Okay. But overall, the New York Times report did not, just objectively did not clear Joe Biden. And the New York Times came out and they were upset. They were refuting it, saying that's not what happened. That's not what we said. So they specifically came out and refuted the sort of Joe Biden talking points. I mean, obviously the mistake that Joe Biden made, the mistake that Joe Biden's campaign made, was lying about the New York Times report. I think that was really the sort of big mistake that Joe Biden made over the past few days, which is why the sort of dam is breaking right now, and why we've been seeing a number of reporters sort of coming out and saying that, look, Joe Biden, you need to address this directly. You can't just have women come out, your potential VP picks who you're trying to court for VP, have only them talking about the allegations. You can't just have your deputy campaign manager or campaign whoever it was come out and make a short, very brief statement denying it. You also have to explicitly and personally come out and answer questions about this. And again, I think that that's happening because Joe Biden lied about the New York Times stuff. Because what you need to understand, guys, is we love to talk about it, how there's the establishment, but really the establishment is just a sort of loose coalition of interest groups who are specifically interested in protecting capital, right? But that's just it. They're a coalition, and they do sometimes disagree, and they do have different interests. And so when Joe Biden comes out and lies about the New York Times report, New York Times isn't too happy about that because they don't want to be seen. It's not in their interest to be seen as someone who's in the tank for the establishment, who's in the tank for Joe Biden. Now, do they oftentimes just play interference, and are they oftentimes in the tank for the in the tank for the establishment? Yes, but they don't want to be seen that way, and it definitely makes individual journalists upset because they want they want to be seen as credible. They want to be seen as legitimate sources of information, and they're not just hacks. Like, that's very important to individual journalists, especially. So they got upset that Joe Biden was making up stuff about them. And so they came out and, kind of directly refuted it. But this led to a number of stuff. I mean, we saw this coming out yesterday. Democratic frustration mounts as Biden remains silent on sexual assault allegation. We saw this article coming out from Ben Smith. Now, Ben Smith has been, a bit up in the air when it comes to some of this stuff, a bit, what his position on some of this stuff is maybe a little bit disputed. And definitely this particular article, if you go through and read it, it's probably not the best framing of Tara Reade's particular allegations, but the headline there, why won't TV news book Tara Reade? it's an interesting headline, and the fact that they ran with that headline is suggestive of the tides changing a little bit. We saw the Washington Post editorial board come out and specifically say that Biden himself must address the Tara Reade allegations and release relevant records. Now, this is particularly important because one of the things that we've been sort of following on this channel is how the University of Delaware has senatorial records stored away. And the University of Delaware originally, when this stuff was coming out, was saying, yeah, we're going to release the information, we're going to release these records to the public so that we can look at it and look through it. But then the University of Delaware reversed their decision and said, you know what, no, we're not going to release anything until 2 years after Joe Biden leaves public life, right? And so that reversal really got people quite upset. And and Tara Reade is claiming that she filed something at the time. Is that in those records? We don't know. Maybe it is, maybe it isn't, maybe it was destroyed at the time, maybe it wasn't, maybe it's in the records. We don't know. We have no idea because the records are being held and are being sealed up at the University of Delaware. And the Washington Post is saying that these records must be released. Now, the interesting question is whether or not relevant records would include, everything that's in, the sort of senatorial stash or whatever at the University of Delaware, or only specific things related to Tara Reade, in which instance, how would we really know? So it's a bit up in the air what this really means, but it is a shift in the weather. It is a change of tide. It is definitely a change of tune. And Chris Cillizza, I was surprised by this. Chris Cillizza coming out and saying that Joe Biden's campaign is twisting the New York Times story to defend against the Tara Reade allegations. I've been critical of Chris Cillizza on this channel, but you know what? Props to him here. He's absolutely right with this headline. Now, some of the stuff in the how he wrote up this specific story, you may be able to dispute, but I was proud of Chris Cillizza to see him writing that headline. I was proud of him, because, like I've said, I've been a bit critical of him at the, sometimes on this channel, but I was happy to see him writing that. So, credit where credit is due. I'm happy to see that. But again, we're seeing the tides really shift, which is interesting. Now, what do I think is going to happen sort of in the long run? Honestly, I think that Joe Biden is probably he probably will at some point, address the statements himself. He'll probably read them from a script, because there's concern that he might go on and ramble and then, mess up, and then it would look really bad or look really weird. He'll probably be trying to read it from a script, or definitely have something specifically memorized that he'll say. And it'll be relatively perfunctory. I don't think that we're going to see, I mean, I honestly think that, we've seen the media trying to cover up this. I think that they will. I think that, once Joe Biden comes out and talks about it, it'll be, oh, he talked about it. And then anytime that he's asked about it in the future, it'll be like, look at when I talked about it then. And so I don't know how much is really going to come out of this, but it is interesting, and it is good, at least, to see a little bit of pushback finally against Joe Biden, because that's all I want. I just want Tara Reade to have a fair hearing, and I want her to have the same standards applied to her as we have seen to other people, when it comes to the Me Too movement. And also, I do think that we are seeing a kind of interesting phenomenon arise when it comes to the Me Too stuff, which is that, recall at the beginning of this when Chris Hayes was specifically saying that oftentimes we can find ourselves in situations where we may be desperate to deny a particular allegation. I think that when it comes to this, one sort of trend that we're starting to see here, which is that when an allegation is first released kind of only in piecemeal, it becomes much more easy to deny, right? So in the case of Tara Reade, she came out on a podcast and more or less just told her story, and there was maybe a few pieces of sort of evidence or corroborating pieces there at the beginning. And that allowed a lot of people who already backed Joe Biden to really sort of put their head in the sand and say, oh, well, I can deny these particular pieces of evidence, and then, sort of basically already sort of plant their feet into the position of, I don't believe Tara Reade. I think that these allegations are false. Look at the blog post that she made about Russia. And then as we see more evidence come around, it's much easier to swat evidence down piecemeal than it is to sort of refute them altogether. Whereas if Tara Reade's allegations had come forward in one sort of investigative report, which by the way definitely wouldn't have happened because Time's Up, as we've talked about on this channel, was basically dragging her along saying, oh yeah, we're looking into it, and then just like, oh well, we can't do this because we're a nonprofit, we don't want to lose our nonprofit status by going up against a politician, blah blah blah, right? We talked about that on this channel. But it is a situation where, because of the fact that there wasn't a big investigative report and all of the evidence that we now have wasn't released at once, it's much easier for people to, sort of deny the evidence piecemeal and then already have their position staked of, I don't believe Tara Reade, and then just, bat down the particular evidence, as opposed to if all the evidence came in at once, and even though they supported Joe Biden, they didn't necessarily have a stake when it came to the Tara Reade allegations. I think that actually does play a factor, at least a factor for this typical Biden bros on Twitter. When it comes to the establishment and when it comes to establishment media, I do think that that's more relevant. That, the factors there probably have more to do with capital and stuff like that. And just how they're more interested in access to these politicians, etc. But when it comes to the typical everyday Biden bro, I think that phenomenon of having piecemeal evidence come at you once you've already made up your mind, as opposed to having all the evidence come in at once, actually is playing a little bit of a role when it comes to this. Does that justify it? No. Does it does it justify their denialism? Absolutely not. But I do think that is playing a little bit of a role, and I think that does help us explain a little bit of the denialism that we've seen when it comes to this incident. So that's just some of my opinions on some of this stuff. You can let me know what you think about it down in the comment section. But for now, if you like the video, I'd appreciate it if you hit the like button and consider subscribing. Thanks.